Hello, I'm Hannah, founder of Velis Commerce, and here we'll be talking about the Lightning Network. This video is for anyone who wants to understand what the Lightning Network is, how it's useful, and how it functions, all without having to dive into any code or read through any technical documentation. You don't need to be a developer or even a very tech-savvy person to follow along with this video. The only thing we are assuming is that you have a basic understanding of what Bitcoin is. So let's get into it. We'll start with the recap on why the Lightning Network was created, we'll explain how it works, and then we'll provide some examples to help you understand why this is such impactful technology. And check out the description for lots of links to further resources. So, Bitcoin. It's a peer-to-peer decentralized network that maintains a ledger of transactions. It's internet money, but as a peer-to-peer protocol rather than a centralized service. Bitcoin itself is architecturally amazing. It allows for a completely open, decentralized peer-to-peer network that accounts for and facilitates the transfer of value. Now, we won't dive into the specifics of how Bitcoin achieves that here, but if you'd like to learn more or need a refresher, check out our video on blockchain mechanics. Also, no technical knowledge is required to follow along with that video. But let's look here at one of the necessary components of the Bitcoin network, which allows it to stay open and decentralized. And that is that everyone needs to know about everything. You can picture the Bitcoin network looking a bit like this, just a bunch of computers scattered all around the world talking to each other, sharing Bitcoin transaction data. This is the peer-to-peer architecture that is required to stay truly decentralized. But this also means that every computer on this network, which we'll refer to as a node, so every node on this network, needs to know about every transaction. So if I'm in Buenos Aires and I walk into Roberto's Cafe and buy a cup of green tea using Bitcoin, well, all the Bitcoin nodes in the world need to know about that transaction. A node in Toronto, a node in Manila, a node in Melbourne, a node in Caracas, etc. All of them, all the nodes need to know about that transaction. This creates some scaling issues for a number of different reasons. First, and most talked about, is transactions per second. When a transaction goes through the process of being included in the blockchain, it has to be mined and included in a block created by a miner. Again, you can check out the blockchain mechanics video if any of this part is unfamiliar. But that block of transaction data has limits on its size for a variety of reasons. But the Bitcoin software has limits on how big that block can be, which means only so many transactions can be mined or included in the next block, which is found or mined roughly every 10 minutes. This places a limit on the transactions per second on the network. Now, estimates vary, but just to give you a rough idea, the Bitcoin network can do, say, about 7 transactions per second, while a very large payment network such as Visa can do maybe 16,000 transactions per second. So you can see that there's a bit of an issue here. But it's not just transactions per second that is a concern. Also, the higher frequency of transactions, the faster the size of the blockchain grows, and the more and more data needs to be transmitted on this global network. So an increase in transactions stresses the network in 3 major ways. First, full blocks, which leads to higher transaction fees as users fight for limited space in the blockchain. Then blockchain bloat as the size of the blockchain grows and grows, and also data latency as all of this transaction data needs to be shared on this global network. Now, for some historical perspective here, if you haven't been following this technology for years now, then you might not be aware that back in 2016 and 2017, there were huge disagreements on how to handle the problems of scaling an open public network of this variety. No need to rehash any of that here, but we will note that there are blockchains out there that are trying scaling in different ways. Now, Velis appreciates the Lightning Network as it addresses all 3 of the scaling issues we've just discussed. So what is this fabulous solution to these daunting technical issues, and how does it work? Well, Lightning is often called Bitcoin's second layer, as it's a network on top of the existing Bitcoin network. And layering protocols in this fashion has a successful history. The internet we all use today actually has 7 layers, from the physical all the way up to the application layer. So this second layer on Bitcoin was formed when trying to answer the question, how can we send and receive Bitcoin transactions but only have local knowledge be required? Can we send and receive without having to tell the entire global network about it? And the answer is yes. There are 2 core concepts that we'll cover in this video: Lightning channels and routing. Now let's introduce our two favorite crypto characters, Alice and Bob. Alice, like me, loves a nice morning cup of green tea, and luckily for her, Bob's Cafe just down the street makes a great cup of green tea. Every morning, she walks over to Bob's Cafe and buys a nice hot cup of tea and pays using a regular on-chain Bitcoin transaction. Well, as Bitcoin gets to be more and more popular, the transaction fees start to rise as more and more people are competing for space in the blockchain. Alice doesn't want to pay a $1 transaction fee for her $3 cup of tea, so she suggests that she and Bob set up a channel with each other. How this works is that Alice will put funds in a special address on the Bitcoin blockchain. From a technical perspective, this is a 2 of 2 multi-sig address. But what this means is that once funds are moved into that address, both Alice and Bob have to sign off on any transaction that moves funds out of that address. It's a bit like putting funds into an escrow account. When the channel is first created, let's say that Alice adds 400,000 Satoshis to this channel. And Satoshis are, of course, the smallest unit of a Bitcoin. So now every morning, Alice walks into Bob's Cafe and needs to give Bob $3 worth of Satoshis. She does this by sending Bob a signed Bitcoin transaction, a real, valid Bitcoin transaction that Bob can at any time add his signature to and broadcast to the on-chain network, or main chain as we call it. But Bob doesn't broadcast that transaction. Instead, he holds on to it. And what this transaction does is update the balance of that channel between Alice and Bob. On creation of the channel, all the funds in the channel belonged to Alice, or we can say that all 400,000 Satoshis were on Alice's side of the channel. Well, let's say after a while of Alice regularly visiting Bob's Cafe, the channel balance will have changed, such that now there are 300,000 Satoshis on Alice's side and 100,000 Satoshis on Bob's side. And again, at any time, either Alice or Bob can close the channel and move the funds that belong to them. But what is important to note here is that Alice can keep sending Bob Satoshis until all the funds in the channel are on Bob's side of the channel, and then maybe he could send them back. And we can do this all without having to ever tell the entire global Bitcoin network about all of these transactions. So now that we understand a bit about how channels work, let's dive into the next core concept here, which is payment routing. Now, you may have asked yourself, what happens if Alice wants to visit a different cafe? Does she need to set up a channel with everyone who she wants to transact with? And no, she doesn't. She can route a payment through her channel with Bob to another person on the larger Lightning Network. So let's imagine that Alice is traveling for a business trip and she spots Charlie's lovely cafe just next to her hotel. She doesn't want to open a channel with him as she has no idea when she'll be back to his cafe. So what she does instead, well, what her Lightning Wallet software will do for her, is find a route on the Lightning Network from her through her channel with Bob all the way to Charlie. Now, in reality, there may be a number of different channels that this payment would go through, but for simplicity's sake here, let's just imagine that Bob and Charlie have a channel directly between each other. So now Alice's wallet can talk to Bob's wallet and say, hey, Bob, how about I send you some Satoshis, but you then send some Satoshis on to Charlie, and I'll compensate you for that by including a very tiny little bit extra for you. There are definitely fees on the Lightning Network, but because the work of forwarding a Lightning transaction is computationally much less work than mining a Bitcoin block, the fees are very small, as in a fraction of a penny small. So Alice updates the balance of her channel with Bob, sending him some Satoshis, and Bob then updates the balance of his channel with Charlie, sending him some Satoshis. After this process is done, Alice has sent out funds, Charlie has received funds, and Bob's total balance across his Lightning channels is unchanged. Plus, he got a tiny little fee for his efforts. This is payment routing. Now, of course, this is the simplified explanation. There are quite a lot of technical specifics happening in this process, and you may have some questions here. Why can't Bob just run off with Alice's money? Can Alice try to claim that she still has the full 400,000 Satoshis in her channel that she started with? And the short answer to questions such as these is that some really clever scripts involving hash time lock contracts and some asymmetry are used to prevent this type of cheating on the Lightning Network. And there are lots more resources linked below if you'd like to dive into the specifics of those scripts. So now hopefully you have a bit of an idea of what's happening on the Lightning Network. Remember, you can watch this video as many times as you'd like. Now let's cover some characteristics of the Lightning Network. Again, transactions on the Lightning Network are real Bitcoin transactions that can be broadcast to the main chain at any time. And this is what gives the Lightning Network its security. The Lightning Network, just like Bitcoin, is built with free open source software, and the network is decentralized and open to anyone. The Lightning Network improves Bitcoin scalability because it allows for Bitcoin transactions to be sent without having to be processed, validated, and recorded by the entire global network. It allows for transactions to be sent with just local knowledge being necessary. Lightning is a faster, cheaper, more scalable, and also more private way to send Bitcoin. So Lightning helps Bitcoin to scale, but what interesting things are we doing with it? Well, let's think again about the features of Lightning. It allows for faster, cheaper, more private payments, but also because the transaction fees are so low, it makes micropayments economically feasible. So let's walk through some of the services that Lightning enables. For example, paywalls. Instead of having to subscribe to a news publication to read that article your friend sent you, instead you can just pay a cent or two to read it. Or how about streaming content or rewarding content creators? One example is Podcasting 2.0. This is where you can directly pay your favorite podcaster while you enjoy their content. Or you can leave a comment on a forum, and if many people find it helpful, you can be directly paid when other users read or upvote your comment. Micropayments for content have the potential to change the economic model of the internet. Instead of paying with your privacy and data when we browse the web, we can actually just send tiny payments to the sites that we use. Or maybe you will get paid for your willingness to share data with the sites that you visit. Because of the speed and efficiency of the Lightning Network, we are beginning to bake it into the back end of all kinds of applications. From the obvious payment apps to delivery services, rewards programs, in-game tokens or rewards, streaming services, etc. Do you want to see some examples of Bitcoin Lightning in action? We've dropped some examples in the comments below, so check it out. So we've covered why the Lightning Network was created, the basics of how it works, and some of the cool applications that are being built with it. I hope you've learned some interesting things here, and don't forget to check out lots more information at veliscommerce.com.